really excited for this show. I cannot believe that it is November. Like, what happened to 2025 that we are literally sitting here, at least here in the United States? Thanksgiving is right around the corner. When does y'all have Thanksgiving? April, right? There's a Thanksgiving in Canada.
Yeah, we do, but we're sneaky about it, and we do it in October. And so usually what happens, if you're like me and you work with a lot of Americans, you take your Canadian Thanksgiving in October and you surprise all the clients with it. Like, no, I can't do that week. It's Thanksgiving. And they're like, what? It's only October. You go, yeah, it's Thanksgiving. And then when U.S. Thanksgiving comes around, you just pretend you're American and you take that off too.
Wow, that's kind of nice.
Works
you get
pretty
the double
good,
dip.
actually. And then Americans don't really think about it. They're like, oh, yeah, of course, it's Thanksgiving. You must be off. I'm like, yep.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
It's a very quiet couple of days in the office.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Well, I'm really excited to have April on our session today. For those of you that don't know April, she's written 2 really amazing books. In fact, April, I read your first book probably in 2020. I think it was during COVID. I think I saw you on a webinar. I can't remember whose webinar it was, but you were talking about positioning and your take on positioning, and you had your book, obviously awesome. And I went and bought it like that day and read it like the next 2 days after that, because I really loved what April had to say about positioning, because up until that point, and I've been doing B2B marketing for 25 years, so I'm a little embarrassed to say what I'm about to say, but I thought positioning was coming up with a cheeky, new, fresh way to say the same darned thing so that you seem a little bit different than everybody else in the market. But April's got a totally different take on positioning, and I'll let her talk about that here in a little bit. And so I bought the book because I'm like, wow, that's an interesting way to think about it. I read the book, and April, I was actually going to show Obviously Awesome today. I looked at my bookcase, I couldn't find it. And then I remembered, I think I have bought and given away your book like 10 times. And so the reason I don't have it right now is I was talking to somebody and they were talking about positioning. I'm like, you got to read this book. And so April didn't stop at Obviously Awesome. She wrote another book, which I think was equally as amazing. And I do have this one. And I think this is maybe my 3rd copy because I've given it away a few times. But Sales Pitch, because the other thing that I see companies struggle with all the time is they come up with positioning, but then it just sits on a shelf. It never becomes messaging, and then ultimately never translates into something that a rep can easily communicate to a customer during the sales pitch. And so you spend all this time and energy trying to figure out what is my position and how do we stand out in the market, but then it never translates into where the rubber meets the road and where people are actually, talking about your service and why they should pick you over the competition. And so without further ado, April, thank you so much for saying yes when I reached out to join us today. We're super excited to have you on the show.
Great to be here. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're going to have a great conversation today. It's interesting. We did a poll. I'll bring up the results of that poll as you guys were registering for this event. We had almost 300 people register for this event. We got some interesting insights. But before I get too far along, I do want to introduce Lauren to you. If you've been here long enough or any of our other shows, Lauren is our moderator. She also runs our HubSpot practice for us at Vindy. You want to say hi, Lauren?
Yep. Hi, everybody. Good to be here today. I've actually already dropped the agenda in the chat, so I'm jumping ahead of Paul a little bit. But if you are super curious, want to see what we're going to talk about today, you can go ahead and click that link now.
Awesome. Yeah. And please, let's keep the chats flowing. What's going to happen today is we'll have a fireside chat with April. She'll be dropping her thoughts and insights on positioning. Would love to get your feedback as we go through it, just on what you're seeing, what you agree with, questions that you have. And then Lauren will curate that for us at the end. I'm sure we'll have a little bit of time, hopefully, to do that. Just to curate some of your questions and have April answer those live for us. I am going to go ahead and share my screen because I took a screenshot of the survey, and thank you everyone that did take the survey as you were getting registered for today's event. Let me get it up here on the screen, and I'm going to make it bigger so you guys can see it. And I know there's been over 200 people that have taken the survey. I took this screenshot after about 100 or so people had taken it. But man, this is such a typical or such an important topic, I should say, because what we're seeing is that nearly 90% of you guys that took the survey are really struggling with positioning, and that you don't feel like the things that you say about your business that separate you from the competition is really landing very well with your audience. And so, man, April's going to help you really unpack what you need to do to fix that. And then if you look at the right side of the survey, the top 3 concerns that you're having is, number 1, standing out with the competition. We're touching on that just a little bit. Number 2, how do I translate my positioning into messaging? And then how do I validate it? How do I know that this unique way, or what April's going to tell you about a little bit later on about differentiated value? How do I know that that's really what matters with our customers? And so, as we're thinking about 2026, I can't think of a better time to start getting our heads around, or wrapping our heads around, how do we improve our positioning? And so with that said, let's go ahead and jump in, April. And the first thing I want to do, I've kind of broken down our agenda today in 4 categories. The first one is just positioning 101. And, I get this question a lot when I'm talking to customers, and that is, who owns positioning? Is it a marketing thing? Is it something else thing? Like, let's just start with who owns positioning. And maybe April, while April's answering that, I'd love to see you guys in chat tell us who owns positioning at your company. But April, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So, I think traditionally we've thought of positioning as a marketing thing, and marketing is often the place where we notice poor positioning first. So marketing feels the pain of bad positioning most acutely, because it's really hard to do effective marketing if your positioning is kind of mushy. So it's hard to drive leads when you don't have a very succinct answer for why pick us versus the other guys. So it feels like a marketing thing. But in my experience, and I spent 25 years as a repeat vice president of marketing at a series of venture-backed startups, in my experience, positioning actually touches different parts of the organization in different ways. And a lot of the root cause of weak positioning is because these different parts of the organization have different opinions about the components of positioning. So, for example, one of the key components of positioning is, who are we positioning against? Right? So I can't have a position in the market if I don't understand, well, who do I need to position against in the minds of customers? Who's that? And I often get really different answers if I ask that question, like, who do we need to position against? If I ask it to product management, I often get a much longer, different list than I would get if I went to sales and asked them, who should I position against? So in my experience, even though marketing can be the keeper of the positioning or the steward of positioning once we have it figured out, the job of figuring it out is generally best done with a cross-functional team, because I want sales input into that. I want product management's input into that. I want to have the founder or CEO involved in this exercise, because if they are not, it is going to be very hard to convince them later that the positioning that we came up with is good and, aligns with their understanding of the market. So I think marketing can kind of own executing on the positioning once we've figured it out. But I don't think that marketing that is developed positioning that is developed in the marketing department, I don't think that's positioning that survives outside of the marketing department. If we really want to change positioning or hone our positioning, that is a cross-functional team effort, and there needs to be a group of people across the senior executive team involved in doing that.
Yeah. And my guess is, if you let marketing own positioning 100%, you probably end up with the new jargon. That's what will happen. They'll go into the conference room, they'll spend a week, they'll talk to customers, maybe listen to a few gong calls, and then they'll come out with a new way to say this thing that you've always been doing, which is really not positioning in the first place.
Sometimes, right? Like a lot of what you'll get is what marketing wants to do with positioning after it's done. So what you'll get is messaging. Yeah. Which is, what are we going to say on the homepage? What does the tagline look like? How do we talk about our value propositions? But what we aren't necessarily going to get is, do we all agree on who we need to position against? And do we all agree on what capabilities that we have that are actually differentiated from those other alternatives? And therefore, can we agree on what our differentiated value is? And we're not trying to sell to everybody if we're B2B. So can we all agree on the definition of what a best fit customer looks like, and therefore the market we intend to win? Those are inputs into messaging. I can't write good messaging until I know the answer to all those questions. And the answer to those questions makes up positioning. So a lot of times what you'll have is when marketing's trying to do this on their own, they'll just jump straight to messaging and be like, whatever, we just need a tagline. Let's just brainstorm on that, and we'll get something that sounds good, or we'll get something that more or less gets it. But this is why the CEO hates it and the head of sales hates it, because they'll be like, well, wait a second, that's not the way we sell. That's not how we win a deal. That doesn't set us apart from anybody else in the market. We sound just like everybody else if you say that. And so this is why we need everybody else involved in the room, because marketing can't do it on their own.
What are some other, so, having one department try to figure out your positioning sounds like a bust, right? We need to have multiple departments and organizations. What are some other common positioning pitfalls that you see out there? Because I know you run these great workshops. You've worked with very big companies. Where else do we get positioning wrong?
Well, there's a handful of things. So one thing is, I would say the main way people kind of mess up their positioning is they have this idea that, the way we're positioned right now is the only way we could be positioned. And usually this comes a little bit from the founding team or the founder, right? The founder will say, look, we're building a business intelligence tool. We're business intelligence guys. We worked in that area. This is our area of expertise. And so, when we started this company, we set out to build a better business intelligence tool. And then we got it out there. We changed it. We messed around with it. Fast forward a year or two, and maybe that business intelligence tool starts looking more like reporting, or it looks more like analytics, or maybe I'd describe it as a data warehouse. Maybe there's, maybe it's kind of turned into something else. But the company internally still is it's a business intelligence tool. That's what we do, man. What else could it be? So that's mistake number one, this idea that it's destiny. We can't change it. It is what it is, and there's no way to mess with it. And if we fail there, then, everything's hopeless and that's it. We just got to roll over and die. That's mistake number one.
Right.
Mistake number two, I touched on before, is this idea that we don't truly understand who the customer compares us to. So for example, if I go to the sales team and say, who do we got a position against? They will list what I would call short list competitors. So competitors that look kind of like you that end up on the customer's short list. They will almost never list Excel or the intern or manual processes, which is what we're trying to replace. And oh, by the way, we're in B2B, so we lose more than half of our deals to status quo.
Exactly. And
status quo looks like Excel most of the time.
Right. Or an intern.
We're not, if we don't know how to ask the question properly, sales will say, well, we don't have to position against status quo. That's not a competitor, but it is. Right. It is. In fact, it's the most fearsome competitor we have. If you look at the way product management looks at this, product management lives a little bit in the future. They're trying to think about the roadmap and where we're going to be in 5 years or 10 years. And so they're very worried about what I would call horizon competitors, like someone that doesn't compete with us now, but when we get that cool feature 2 years from now that we're building, then we're going to compete with them. But the reality is, in our positioning today, we don't have to compete against a ghost. If a customer never puts that company on a short list, I don't have to position against them. And in fact, we're notoriously bad at predicting the future. So even though my product management team is saying, we'll see those guys, we'll see them for sure. 2 years from now, we'll see them. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. And the reality is, we're not carving the positioning into the stone tablets here. In 2 years, when we get that thing out, we're going to adjust our positioning because we're going to offer different value to different kinds of customers, and we can change the positioning when we get there. So I would say those are kind of the two big problems I see. One is people think, we can't position as anything else than we are today because, we are what we are and that's it. Or, we don't have anything unique or differentiated because we're looking at this weird superset that includes 15 companies that are two guys in a basement that haven't sold anything.
Right.
So we need to really understand, what do we actually have to position against?
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. And, one of the things that I really want us to talk about today, because we kind of, talked about who owns it and where do we get it wrong. But the big eye opener for me when I heard you the very first time 5 years ago or so was this concept of, differentiated value. Because like I mentioned in my preamble there, that I just thought positioning was fancy new words to, you sell a left-handed smoke shifter. Let's come up with a new way to call a left-handed smoke shifter, a right-handed smoke shifter, or something like that. It's not differentiated value. And I really want this audience to understand your perspective on that, because, man, I feel like when you can get to that, that is a true game changer and something that's going to make our buyers stand up and pay attention. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So in my opinion, this concept of differentiated value is probably the most important thing for you to get your arms around if you want to do really good positioning. So it works like this. So we start with, who's my competition? So who actually ends up on a short list? Who's the status quo that I'm trying to replace? That's my stake in the ground. This is what I have to position against. And then I can look at, well, what have I got that the other guys don't have? And this is capabilities of the product and capabilities of the company. So let's say, I got this AI thing and it's really cool and nobody else has it. Differentiated value is the answer to the question, well, so what? I got that thing. It's cool. But what, if I'm the customer sitting there getting the pitch, okay, you got this nifty AI thing. So what? What's the value to my business? How is that going to help me make money? How is that going to help me save money? It's really the answer to the question, why pick us over the other guys? And so most of the time, the way we do this in the work I do with clients, we understand who the competitors are. We list out all these differentiated capabilities. And then we do this kind of so what exercise where we're like, okay, you've got this big capability, so what? And then we're looking for the themes that pop out of that. And so we're trying to figure out, the 1, 2, 3 big differentiated value themes that come out of that. And what we should have at the end of that step is we should be able to say, hey, customer, you want to pick us over anybody else you could choose because we're the only company on the planet that can deliver you this plus this. And the features are tucked in underneath. So I'll give you an example of that. So I worked for this company and we had this database. At the time, we thought it was a database, this database thing. And we had this feature and it was cool. We had a patent on it and it was this fuzzy logic algorithm. So we had the patented fuzzy logic algorithm. No one knows what that is because we're the only ones that have it. We have a patent on it. So we can't just say, hey, we got the fuzzy logic. Nobody knows what that is. So we, write it down on the board. We have patented fuzzy logic algorithm. So what? Why do I care about that? And the answer to so what was, well, if you were doing a certain kind of analytic query, this fuzzy logic algorithm meant that you could do the query really, really fast. In fact, the first customer we worked with, they had a query there was so much data and the query was so complicated that they could only run it on a Friday because it took 2 days to run. Jeez. And you get the answer on Monday. And we could do that in 3 minutes,
So they're not input it incorrectly.
Yeah, that's
right. So, so we could do that in 3 minutes, wahoo. And so we thought, well, being able to run a really fast query, that's the value, right? So then we went out and we figured anybody that has a mountain of data that needs to run a query like that cares about doing it in 3 minutes versus 3 days. And it turned out that wasn't true. So we went to a bunch of big banks and said, hey, you probably have to do one of these queries and you run it over the weekend. And they're like, yeah, we got that query. Yeah, we run it over the weekend. And we're like, wouldn't you like to do it in 3 minutes? And they're like, I don't know, man. We only do it twice a month. And it's okay if it runs over the weekend. It's not urgent that we get it done right away. And we're like, oh. So we just assumed that the speed thing was the value. Now, we landed a couple of deals, and with those customers, when we went to them and asked them, why'd you pick us? Why do they care? And they said, oh, well, the speed thing is really important because we actually have to do this query to answer a customer call in support. So if a customer calls us with a certain kind of question, we have to run that query, and we can't wait 3 days to call them back. We want to be able to do it while they're on the call in 3 minutes. So then what that opened up for us is, so patented fuzzy logic. So what? We can do a query really fast. So what? So we can answer a customer's support call while they're on the phone. So what? So that's going to reduce churn. That's the so what.
There you go.
This is what we're trying to get to in differentiated value. Like, it's not the feature. It's what's the feature going to do for my business? And you got to get really specific about that.
Yeah, that's so good. Back in the 90s, I worked for a giant technology company that doesn't exist anymore today. A company called Storage Tech. You probably remember them, April, back in the 90s.
I vaguely remember Storage Tech.
Yeah, they were the big. This is back when storage was tape drives, not always disk drives or storage. But it was an engineering-led company. And man, I was a sales guy for them. And it was like every 6 months, it was like, here's 6 new features that nobody wanted and go sell it, And so there wasn't ever that connection of the so what and building out something that would make it matter to customers. And so that's why you got to take the time to really figure this stuff out.
Right.
You mentioned, I can't remember if it was in the book or I heard it on a podcast, but this concept of go find your hair on fire customer and really understand what it is about your product that they can't live without. And that's a good way to try to get your head around positioning. Do you remember talking about that, or can you add to that?
I don't actually, but okay. Usually that was me. No, I don't know. Here's the thing. Like, once you understand your differentiated value, then the next question is, well, who cares a lot about that?
Right.
And the reality is, like, again, we thought, if I take my fuzzy logic example, we thought that anybody with a mountain of data that needed to do analytic query would be a good fit customer for us. And it turned out it wasn't true. It turned out lots of companies have a ton of data and they don't care about doing that query fast at all. So it turned out the only people that cared about it were the people that had to do it, with a time constraint. So it was, a customer was calling in customer support. And so when we asked that question, then we said, what kind of companies need to answer a question like that in customer support? And the answer at the time was, if you were an ad tech company, you did. So, because ad tech companies were analyzing all this data, it was machine generated data. There was absolute mountains of it. And occasionally a customer would call in and say, hey, what's going on with this? And you would have to run this query. Now, this was kind of bad news because, if you said, well, how many ad tech companies are there out there? The answer was not a lot, man.
Right.
And so it was a bit of an oh shit moment for us where we were like, okay, well, is that big enough for us to hit our revenue number for the year if we look at all the ad tech companies out there? And the answer was not really. And so we had to do some research and go splunking around to figure out, was there any other use case where there was real value in being able to answer this kind of a question really quickly? And the thing that we discovered in our research on that was the other situation where you'd have to answer this really quickly is if there was a security breach happening. And
sure.
if you were doing security and you were looking at your live data that was coming in and there was some kind of a breach, it would be really important that you could figure that out really quickly in 3 minutes, better than 3 days.
Oh yeah.
And so once we figured that out, then that opened up this whole other addressable market for us that we could go chase with that same technology. But do you see how this differentiated value thing is so important? Like, if we didn't really understand the differentiated value, then we wouldn't have even known where to go looking for more opportunity for this particular thing. So, when we get differentiated value, it's really important that we follow that up with, okay, well, who cares a lot about that? Because just because we have it doesn't mean everybody cares the same about it. Like, I was working with a company a couple of years back, and they had this thing that allowed you to do processing of invoices. So if you had a lot of temporary employees and you need to send out invoices, they could do that really, really fast and efficiently, even if the number of invoices was huge. And so same thing, we ask ourselves the questions and say, well, who's got that problem? Well, if you don't send out a lot of invoices, you don't care really because, it takes you a little bit longer, but there's not that many of them. So your value isn't as much. So we were like, okay, well, who's got a lot of invoices? And it's like, okay, well, industries where there's a lot of temporary employees. So then we ended up focusing on a handful of really narrow verticals. Like one of them was engineering consulting practices because they have tons of temporary employees. They're all fairly highly paid. Everybody has a fit if the invoices don't get paid really fast. And so, there were a handful of really specialized verticals that we focused on because they really, really had the problem. And it made our value worth a lot to them to be able to come in and solve that problem.
Yeah. And, I'm just connecting dots here. A couple of things. One, this is absolutely why positioning needs to be C-suite buy-in, multi-departmental, because what we're talking about is really strategic direction of our business, right? Because we're not trying to be everything to everybody.
Strategy, really. It's how do we go to market? Like, who are we focused on? What's the value? Who are we up against? Where are the places in the market where we can easily get to revenue? Is that big enough to make our number? If it's not, oh no, we're going to have to do something about that. Yeah.
And the thing I want the audience to hear too is positioning really has to, thinking about April's way of differentiated value, you've got to find that niche market that's big enough that cares enough, right? And because what I see in doing, digital marketing for B2B companies for 25 years is they want to sell to everybody, every possible person that can fog a mirror and sign a check. That's my target audience. And the reality is when you're forced to try to build messaging and positioning and campaigns and all of that by selling to everybody, you're never going to sell to anybody because there's no way you can be differentiated like that to every market. But listening to April here talk about it today, even in these couple of examples, it's like when we can find that subset of customers that this really, really, really matters, that's who we need to go after. And that's, and we need to scream it from the rooftops. And sure, it's going to turn off 90% of people that might be able to write you a check, but it's really going to turn on the 10% that care about those things, right?
Well, that's right. And the reality is that 90%, wasn't going to pick you anyway, because your value just wasn't that strong to them. I've had lots of examples of this, but the first one is, I worked in-house at a company and we had this enterprise CRM, so CRM for big companies. And we were up against this big competitor. Like at the time, Salesforce was only selling at the bottom of the market, but there was this big competitor called Siebel. And so, we were trying to sell to every enterprise out there, and Siebel was selling to every enterprise out there and kicking our tail, right? Because they had a way more mature product. Like they had way more customers than us. They were more famous than us. They were 8,000 employees. We were 10, there's just no reason you would pick us over them, to be honest, other than the fact that we were cheaper. But most of the time people didn't care that much that it was cheaper. Like it had to do the thing that they wanted it to do. And we looked kind of risky. And so, we had a feature that was really differentiating. The problem was we didn't really understand the value of it. And so we eventually landed a deal with an investment bank. And that kind of gave us this insight into why it could be really, really valuable if you had a sales motion that really depended on relationships. And so once we understood that, then we were like, well, this is actually a really, really great fit for investment bankers. And so we had this conversation internally, like maybe we're not CRM for enterprises, maybe we're CRM for investment bankers. And it was a hard discussion internally, because internally people were like, well, wait a second, that's so small. Like, how many investment banks are there out there? And if we say we're just going after that, how are we ever going to grow? And who really hated it was our investors. The investors were like, you look like a lifestyle business here, people. We invested in you to go take Siebel on and wipe those guys off the planet. And now you're saying you're just going to go after investment banks. Like, how are you ever going to get to be 100 million revenue doing that? And our strategy in that case was, look, like, we don't actually win anywhere outside investment banking. So we might as well say we're just for investment banking, because then at least the investment bankers will find us and we look differentiated from the big generic market leader who says they're for everybody. And then, but the plan was always, if we could figure out a way to dominate investment banking, then we would widen the aperture a little bit. And then we would start going after retail banking as well, because being good at investment banking would give us permission to go in and do retail banking. And then the plan was, if we got really good at that, then we could go into insurance and say we were CRM for financial services and shift the positioning that way. So we sort of had this long-term strategy that had us picking the markets off one by one until we eventually got big enough that we could take Siebel out. That was the strategy. The reality is we got so successful. So first of all, there was a lot more investment banks than you think. So when we went down and did the list of banks, there's way more than we thought there was, thousands, in fact. Second thing was, as we got some success in banking, it gave us the ability to raise the prices. So our average deal size got a lot bigger, and our efficiency in marketing and sales went way up because we're just trying to talk to investment bankers. So we're only going to places where the bankers hang out. We're only doing lead gen stuff that's focused on bankers. So our bang for our buck went way up, as opposed to this generic nothing marketing we were doing before. We'd be lucky to get one lead for like thousands of dollars of investment. And so we ended up growing quite quickly. We never actually did go beyond investment banking, and we got to around 70, 80 million revenue in a year and a half. And then the big CRM came and acquired us for like $1.5 billion. But I know this fear, like the fear is, we're going to make this, we're just going after this little wee thing. And, what if it's too small? And it is possible, like if the addressable market is so small, like if you say, well, we're only going to go after companies like this, and you can only put 30 of them on a list, and you got to do 5 deals this year. Okay, that's too small. But if you say, I got to do 10 deals this year and to make my number, and I've narrowed down to a market where there's thousands of companies, it's big enough. In fact, it's probably big enough for next year too.
Yeah. Seth Godin calls it the smallest viable market. Go find the smallest viable market that you can sell to and build your solution to really solve for that, which is a great example, April, of what you just described. And I loved how you even, your roadmap that you're able to show investors was this concentric circles, right? We start with investment bankers, but hey, these are the next guys on the horizon. These are the next guys on the horizon. But you needed to pitch that to the investment bank or to your investors so they would continue to support you. But you never even really needed to go to that next rung before you guys achieved your exit strategy. That's pretty cool.
So that concept is really old. So that concept is from Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. It's called bowling pin strategy. And we used to draw this bowling pin thing, on the whiteboard. Every time we talk to an investor, we're like, okay, lead pin is investment banking. But then when we knock that off, we're going to get retail banking, blah, blah, blah. But that's Jeffrey Moore who came up with that idea, like whatever that was.
Oh, yeah, that was a great
back
book.
in the 90s.
Yeah, I read that a long time ago. Well, let's transition the conversation because we've been talking about differentiated value and positioning 101. I know that a lot of you, based on the survey, are struggling with even getting your messaging or getting your positioning into words that would be on your website and your marketing materials. We'll talk about pitch decks and things like that in the next segment. But for right now, April, I'd love to get your perspective of, let's say we figured out our differentiated value, or we think we have a good differentiated value. How do we turn that into words that show up in our websites and our marketing material? How do we know that it's going to resonate with our audience? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So here's my experience. So we figure out our positioning, meaning we understand who the real competition is. We understand what makes us different. We have this differentiated value, which is why pick us versus the other guys. We know what a good fit customer looks like, and we understand the market category that we intend to dominate. So now we got positioning. So the question is, how do we test that? The marketers, what we would naturally tend to do if, on the marketing side of things is we would test this in a marketing way, which means, well, I would take that positioning, I would translate it into messaging, I would put it on a landing page, and I would A/B test it against the old messaging and figure out what, is it working better than the new messaging? And so I tried doing this lots of times and it was a disaster for 59 million ways. Let me give you like 4 or 5. One is, now I'm not testing positioning. I'm testing messaging. I've taken that positioning. I've translated it into messaging. Maybe I did a good job on that. Maybe I did a terrible job on that. Who knows? And so if it fails, was it the positioning that made it fail or was it the messaging that made it fail? Also, I'm putting it on a landing page. Maybe the design of that landing page is crap. Right. So maybe the test failed because my landing page design was terrible. Here's another thing. I got to drive traffic to that landing page and do this test. Well, was it the right traffic? Are these actually my best fit customers? And so did it fail because my best fit customers didn't like it, or did it fail because I had a bunch of randos show up and it had nothing to do with my best fit customers? And so, and then here's the other thing. Let's say you were amazing at designing landing pages and you're awesome at doing messaging and you're awesome at figuring out how to get your best fit customers to go there. And then the thing fails. Why did it fail? Who knows? You have no idea. Like, you don't know if it failed because you have the wrong target customers or the wrong value proposition or the wrong market category. You've learned nothing. You've learned nothing. All you've learned is that, the other one was better. Why? Who knows? So this, I think, is a terrible way to test positioning, and I wouldn't recommend anybody do it that way. Instead, the companies that I work with are all B2B, and they all have a sales team. So the natural way to test positioning is to take positioning, translate it into a sales pitch deck, train a sales rep on that sales pitch deck, and then let's test it with qualified prospects. The reason this is better is because, first of all, I can control for a lot of things. So I can control for exactly who am I pitching to. Well, I'm only going to pitch to somebody who's been lightly qualified in the first place, so I know they're my best fit target customers. Secondly, I'm not testing the actual words. It's a bit more vibey than that, right? So I have a story that matches my positioning, but a good sales rep, if they say a word and the customer reacts to the word, they're just going to try another word. It's really the story is more what you're testing. Third thing is, I got a live customer on the line here, right? So if we're doing this over a Zoom call or in a face-to-face meeting, I can see the person's face. So I can see when they're making this scrunched up face, like, I don't understand a thing you're talking about, buddy. Or I can see when the customer's getting all excited. I can write down the questions that the customer asks. So the customer might say, oh, wow, that sounds amazing. You sound just like Salesforce. And you're like, nothing like Salesforce. And you're like, oh, man, I'm going to write that down. Okay, We've messed this up somehow. So I get all this signal in a conversation with a customer that I could never get off an anonymous A/B test on a landing page. And so in the work that I do with clients, we take the positioning, we translate that positioning into a sales pitch. We train a sales rep on the sales pitch, and then we go and do a bunch of test pitches. And at the end of every pitch, we're like, okay, what's working and what's not working in this pitch? How can we iterate on it? Oh, people don't like that word. Oh, we're getting an objection we didn't think we were going to get. Oh, we drew this picture, but nobody knows what the heck we're talking about in this picture. So let's throw it out and draw a new picture. And we do these test pitches until we get to the point where my best sales rep says to me, I think we have the kinks worked out of this. And importantly says, and you know what? I like this pitch better than the old pitch. At that point, we're validated. Like, salespeople hate new pitches. They're all comfortable with the old pitch, even if the old pitch sucks, because they're used to it. They memorized it. They got a little joke they tell on slide 3 or whatever. If we give them a new pitch, like, that pitch has got to be really good for them to say, yeah, I'm with this new pitch now and not the old one. So if I can do this and have a salesperson say, yep, this is good, and I like it better than the old pitch, I'm golden. So at that point, I would call the positioning validated. I would take that sales rep, I can use them to train the rest of my sales team and write a script that looks like what that salesperson is doing. And now I've got not just the component pieces of positioning, but an actual story that I can then send to to marketing to go build messaging around that.
Wow, that is brilliant. I love that because of all the variables that you've been able to eliminate, you've checked so many boxes, right? You've eliminated variables from, like you described, hey, let's A/B test this. Let's see what happens. But not only that, you've turned one of your sales reps into a champion that's promoting the new positioning, which now, we all feel it. Most of us on here are marketers. We all feel that pain of, man, I just spent 3 months building this thing and they're not doing anything with it. Well, if we can turn our best sales rep or one of our sales reps into a champion, that's going to help. And April, now that we're talking about the sales pitch, man, when I read your book, Sales Pitch, everybody, by the way, everybody needs to go get both of these books. We've got them, right behind April there. We've got them linked on the agenda. I told this to April and I wasn't selling April to come on the show, but I just told her the truth that in the last 10 years, those are two of the very best business marketing books I've read, and I read a lot. So April, you've done a brilliant job of communicating these things. But man, when I read Sales Pitch and I kind of learned your framework, it is so different than every other frickin' sales pitch that's out there, which is, hey, thank you for your time today. Can I feature dump to you every single thing that we do? And you tell me which of these features you care about, Mr. Customer. And then they wonder, why are we not selling anymore? But I swear, April, your framework, and I've built my own pitch. I do the selling here at Vendy around your framework. And so can you help us understand what's different about the way that you help these companies figure out their pitches that isn't just a Zoom call and let me pull up my software, click on every button until you just buy? How is your pitch different than that?
Yeah. So when I started, as a junior product marketer, I was often tasked with building a sales pitch deck. And every company I worked at up to a certain point, that's exactly how, the pitches went. They weren't even really pitches. It was like, hi, we're here. We're going to give you what we call the product walkthrough demo, which was like, look, we got 4 drop down menus at the top. I'm clicking on every single one and I'm going to go, thing by thing by thing down the drop down menu and tell you everything it does and until we run out of time. And then at the end of that, I'm going to say, are you sold yet? Do you want to, can I get your credit card now? And that's just kind of how I thought it was done. And even today, the companies I work with, a lot of them are doing, more or less that, it's a product walkthrough. We're going to show you all the stuff. And that went on like that until, I got this job at IBM. And at IBM, they had a structure for building a pitch deck, and it had been developed with a set of consultants that they had worked with, and it was designed specifically for IBM. So it was designed for these monster huge deals that IBM would do and really long sales cycle. But there was this 59 components of a good sales pitch deck. And oh my God, like at the beginning when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, this is so over engineered. But there are 2 things about the IBM pitches I really liked. One was they never talked about features outside of the context of the value. So they would say, we're going to improve the speed of doing this process by 1,000%. Let me show you how we do it. And then they would show you the feature, right? But they would always lead with the value. So value first and then features. And I thought, well, that's pretty smart. And again, they didn't have 59 points of value. They had 2 or 3. And so they would say, here's the value. Here's how we do it. Here's value number 2. Here's how we do it. And I thought, well, that's way better than just dumping the features. We're telling them, why the features matter. So I like that. The second thing was they never started to pitch. Like sometimes if we were being really tricky at the companies I worked with before, sometimes we would start the pitch by talking about the problem. But the way we defined the problem was always really vague. So we would say, like, I was at this company, we were selling a database, and we're like, you know what the problem is? And the customer would be like, what? And we'd say, you're storing a lot of data. Like, in fact, it's going up exponentially every year, how much data you're storing. You know what you need? A database. And then we would show you all the features of the database. So it was dumb because, any database could solve that problem of storing data. It was so dumb. It was just this really generic version of the problem. What I liked at IBM never started that way. They would start with IBM's perspective on the problem. And that's different. So IBM would come in and they'd say, like, one of the big things IBM had with their database is that their database was really open and it played nice with other systems and it had better APIs, and all the other databases were quite closed. They were trying to sell you database plus an application plus middleware all tightly joined together. And IBM would come in and say, we know you're storing a lot of data. We know you're storing a lot of data. How much data? Oh, our research shows this. It's getting worse every year, tons and tons of data. And the customer would say, yeah, dummies, we know that. We're storing a lot of data. Yeah, we're storing. And then IBM would say, well, why are we storing the data? Why are we storing all that data? Because we think we're going to do stuff with it, right? Like machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we think that that's not just data. It is a strategic business asset. And the CIO would say, yes, that's why we're storing it all, man. Okay. So if we think that data is a strategic business asset, don't I want to put it somewhere where it's easily accessible by anything? By stuff now and also stuff in the future that we can't even predict? The last thing I want to do is put it in something that's all locked in and doesn't play nice with anything else, right? So I loved this idea. Like, they would start right from the very beginning of a pitch by framing the problem in a way that only we could solve it. And so they basically looked at their differentiated value, which in their case was openness, right? And playing nice with other things and good APIs and all that stuff, and said, we got to make the case for that right from the beginning. So anyways, after I left IBM, I went to a little startup. And we repositioned the company, and me and the new VP sales sat down together and said, well, we're going to make new sales pitches out of this that reflects this positioning. And so, and IBM had this binder where they kept a 59-step thing of building a sales pitch. And so I stole that. So I hauled out the binder and said, look, I stole this from IBM. Maybe we could take some of this. And so we ended up taking the IBM structure and kind of startupifying it. So we threw out maybe 50% of it because it was so specific for IBM. But we stole in particular this idea of framing the pitch with our insight, and then having the bulk of the pitch be oriented around the differentiated value. And so that's the way I've been teaching companies how to do pitches ever since. And that second book, Sales Pitch, I specifically wrote that book to help companies solve that problem. Like, you got your positioning done. You want to go test the positioning. Okay, well, then I'm telling you to test it using a sales pitch. And then everybody's like, well, how do we build a good sales pitch? And I'm like, oh, man. So then I wrote another book to describe how I do it. I think there's lots of other ways to build a sales pitch, but that's the way I figured out how to do it. And that's the way I've been doing it with my clients ever since.
Yeah, I can't remember if this is in the book or I heard it on one of your podcasts, but in getting ready for this show. But you talk about a company that was a sales enablement company and how you help them
level
position. Can you walk through that real fast? Because I think that will help just really crystallize this for folks.
Yeah. So this is a company I worked with a bunch of years ago, and they're here in Toronto, and they're called Level Jump Software, and they're in the sales enablement space, which is, so what sales enablement is like, think training for new sales reps in a very basic way, but like helping your reps get more effective. And so they were in that space, and it is a terrible space to be in, super competitive, lots of competitors, lots of very well-funded competitors. They were a small company, mainly bootstrapped, so they hadn't raised a lot of money. They hired me to come in and work on the positioning. So we started with, okay, who's your competition? Like, all their competition kind of fell into like 2 or 3 buckets. Like, lots of small companies, if you were just starting out and you only had a few reps, you just put your sales enablement materials on a shared drive and that was it. But if you got a little bigger and things got a little bit more complex, then what they'd do is they'd use a solution, and there are lots of solutions on the market that are basically a CMS or content management system. So you could do versioning and control and make sure that the reps had access to the right thing at the right time. And then if you got really fancy, there were this other category of solutions, and they were essentially an LMS. Like, I could define a course and have people go through a course, and I could see how far they went, and, did you pass the course or not, give them a test. So that was the competition. And they were like, okay, what do you got that the other guys don't have? And it wasn't a lot of stuff, to be honest. And the big thing they had was they had built this thing inside a Salesforce. So it was built on the Salesforce infrastructure, on the Salesforce data structure. So it's inside Salesforce as an integrated piece inside Salesforce. Okay, that's the thing. And so then the question was, well, what's the value of that? So what?
Yeah, so what?
And we were a little stuck on that at the beginning. Like some folks were in the room were like, well, it's really easy for the reps. If they want to do the sales enablement stuff, it's all inside Salesforce and they don't have to go out to another application. And I'm like, that sounds kind of lame. Like, how hard is it to go to another application? Like, is it really all that valuable? And the founder said, no, that's not it. He says, here's the big thing. Because the data is all together, the training data and the sales data, we can actually tell you whether or not the sales enablement stuff worked with sales metrics. So did the enablement improve time to first deal? Did the enablement improve time for the rep to make quota? And you care about that because, if it takes the rep 2 months to make quota versus 1 month to make quota, you've made a lot more money out of that rep. Oh, that sounds like very crunchy value. So then we're like, okay, that's the big value. So then we're like, all right, so then we're going to build a sales pitch around this thing. So the original sales pitches looked like this product walkthrough where they were like, here's how you build the training. Here's how you do the training. Here's how you distribute the training. Here's how the reps take the training. And the very last thing they'd show is like, here's how you tell if the training is working or not. So if you looked at this demo, they look just like everybody else. So instead, we re-architected it to start with this insight. So they're selling to the head of sales enablement, right? So they come in, they're talking to the head of sales enablement at a tech company that's hiring a lot of salespeople. And you walk in and you say, sales enablement is really important, right? And the head of sales management, like, yeah, dummy, that's my job. Yeah, it's really important. And why is it important? It's important because every day your rep's not making quota costs you money, right? How much money? They have this nice little graph show you, how much money. And the head of sales enablement goes, yeah, you're right. And then they're like, okay, well, look, we work with lots of companies just like you. And here's how they do sales enablement. They put on a shared drive. The customer says, yeah, we used to do that, but then it got too complicated. Yeah. Or you could use these solutions or these solutions. You could content management system. Now I know people are using the right stuff. Or I've got an LMS and I could tell who took the training and who didn't take the training. But you know what none of those things do? None of them is going to tell you whether or not the training worked. So when your boss comes to you and says, hey, that sales enablement program we're running, is it working? How do you show your boss that it is or it isn't? Like, how do you justify your job? We want that, don't we? Now, let me show you how we do that. So we took the thing that the one thing they had that was differentiating and put that right in the middle and made that everything. And in this case, it's a good pitch and it works because the person sitting on the other side is like, yeah, man, that's actually really important to me because I get fired if I can't prove that. Anyways, and they got acquired. They don't exist anymore. They got acquired by Salesforce. Everybody's rich.
Yeah. It's like every company you seem to work for, you figure out their positioning and then they get bought by the big guys. That's pretty good.
Some of them. Yeah, some of them. Sometimes I am working for the big guys and what we're positioning is a bunch of stuff that they've bought and now they've bought it and it's all together and the reps don't know how to pitch that.
Right, because it's like a Frankenstein. How do I turn this thing into a story, right?
Yeah,
you mentioned something, and I'm going to touch on this real quick, but in that story, when you have a really strong differentiated value, like, hey, we can actually show you that your sales enablement is working and nobody else can, then you can do something you talk about in your book, which is competitive alternatives, right? Because if I know that my differentiated value for this group of people is so strong, then I can be brave enough to say, hey, there's 3 other ways you could do this, but why would you? Because you really need this thing. Anything you want to touch on there?
You can do that without necessarily naming the competitor. Like in the case of Level Jump, they didn't name Seismic or HighSpot or any of those companies. They just put them in a bucket in terms of the way they approach the problem. So they'd say, look, it's a CMS or an LMS. I don't care which company you're talking about. And sometimes the customer would say, oh, well, we're looking at Seismic. And we'd say, yeah, they're one of these. but they're
Right.
all the same, how they
Yeah.
approach the problem. So we can talk about alternative approaches to the problem and then contrast our approach to the problem to other ones.
Yeah, and you can only do that if you've got differentiated value, because if you don't, if it's easy for the client to think you're one of those other two buckets, so your differentiated value's got to be strong and compelling. And then, quite frankly, when you get that head bob in the sales pitch where they're going, yeah, I mean, really, I do need to protect my job. I really do need to make sure that this stuff's working. You've got the sale at that point, because why would they go with the other alternatives? Because they're not going to help them. Right.
And notice what you're doing in that step as well. Like, you're not just positioning yourself, you're positioning all the other guys too. Like, you're essentially going there and putting baby in the corner, right? We're like, yeah. It's just like another CMS. They're all the same. Stick them in the corner.
Yeah. We don't have time for it today, but when you guys read the book, there's a great story in here about April buying a toilet for her house that basically walks through this process. And I'm just going to leave it there. You'll have to read the book to find out how that worked out. But it's a great story, and it really connects to creating a pitch that matters, because we, at the end of the day, know way more about solving these problems for our customers than they do themselves. You know, many of our clients, they're buying stuff. This may be one or two times they're making a decision like this, but we solve these problems for our clients every day. They're looking for help. And quite frankly, and you'll read this in April's book, they trust you more when you can say, hey, this is our perspective on the world. Here's kind of the way you could deal with it. Here's what I would recommend. It just puts you in a much better position. You're this consultant at that point, not really just another rep trying to get the deal. And so April's got her two books I've mentioned. I've got them linked off in the agenda. Please check them out. They're very awesome books. I am going to be wrapping here pretty quick, because our promise to you guys is we'll wrap at the top of the hour. There is a place to register for next month's B2B Growth Show. We're going to be walking through some things you need to be thinking about in your go-to-market plan for 26. I know most of you guys are probably pretty far along with that, but we want to give you some fresh perspective. And that's one of the reasons why we asked April to come to our show in November, because I know that this is pretty much a time of year people are thinking about, is my messaging right? Is my positioning right? And so, April, thank you so much for joining us today. It was awesome having you. You dropped a lot of really good knowledge bombs in my perspective to the audience. And I think hopefully everybody will grab your books and learn how to upgrade their positioning and be in a good place for next year. April, thank you for your time.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. And thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care, guys. We'll see you next month.